I have a running story I'd like to share, seeing as how I'm running more now than I am mountain biking. I'm running again as my primary means of aerobic conditioning now that cycling season is over. Running is always on standby for me, ready to fill in when other activities aren't getting my full attention. That's where I'm at now. With my last race well and truly behind me, cycling no longer dominates my training schedule the way it did in the lead up to Leadville. I'm not training for any cycling events at all right now, and
you sit on a throne of lies.
Winter is also here in all its frozen glory. That means I don't have a lot of reasons to ride, and even if I did, I have fewer cycling options available to me. Not zero, but fewer. A lot of my training has moved indoors as a result of the cold and snow, and a lot of it has nothing to do with cycling right now. Mainly because both the cold and the snow have settled in for the next several months, making cycling a resource-intensive rigmarole for even short rides. This is Canada, after all, eh? You know what that's about.
Oh, you didn't see her there. We're sorry.
Oh, sorry.
What used to be 100-kilometer rides for a few hours at a time has now been reduced to 10-kilometer rides that take almost as long to gear up for. Actual saddle time is probably an hour if I'm lucky. That makes indoor training a better alternative and a fact of life for any serious athlete living in this country. And I'm getting softer with age when it comes to running or riding outside in sub-zero temps. I'm tired of the cold in the same way you get tired of a guest at a party who doesn't know when to leave. But at this stage of my life, I have come to accept that I'm living in a winter city and must cope with all that entails. And it's basically learned helplessness as far as my attitude about it is concerned. I know it's going to get cold. I know it's going to snow, but rather than move to a warmer climate, I just get pissy about it and blame seasonal affective disorder for why I'm surlier than usual. I have to wear more layers than a Russian doll when I go outside for anything that requires me to be exposed for more than a few seconds. Even walks from the front door to my car door require full winter garb, or I'm not going. I shovel my sidewalks when it snows like I'm breaking rocks on a chain gang.
Some men you just can't reach.
And I'm just counting down the weeks and months until the temperature rises above zero from the very first moment it drops below freezing. There are all sorts of people who try to put a positive spin on winter here. I even used to be one of those people. Not anymore. Winter is a drag.
And I'm tired of pretending it's not.
I can't complain too much from the standpoint that I definitely took advantage of the warmer weather when it was here. I was outside running and riding almost every single day. And thank goodness for that, because those memories help on days when going outside means contending with weather that seems intent on killing every living thing exposed to it. But before the snow fell and the temps dropped, I did my best to build up a catalog of warm weather memories that I could reflect upon when I was at wit's end with winter's effects. I am currently at wit's end with winter's effects. One of my favorite memories from those days is a 10-mile running race in the fall that was equal parts tradition and legacy for me. I don't share a lot of my running adventures, mostly because I'm not really operating a running channel here. Although, full disclosure, I have no idea what kind of channel I'm operating here. Whatever running content I do share tends to be a side quest to whatever's going on in my life and not necessarily the main thing keeping me busy or defining my world.
The goal is to take that child on a run with me. And I'm not sure that I'm optimistic about how this is going to turn out.
But I feel like the cold is making me want to talk about some of the running I did last year in warmer weather, and that it deserves a bit of discussion as far as how things have changed for me over the years as a runner. Mostly because running this last race was a lot of fun for me for reasons that will become clear, and also because I have completed this race multiple times over the last few years, and that makes comparisons interesting from year to year insofar as what I've learned about myself myself as a runner and an athlete. Talking about the race now might help contextualize my running history in broad terms, having done this event multiple times at 2 different distances. And each time I've done it, there's been a modification to my training leading up to it. I've used all the standard tools runners rely on to get better at running, from heart rate to pace, cross-training to overtraining. I've done it all, except for power meters. I didn't even know that power was a legitimate metric for running, as it always seemed like a finicky gimmick when I looked into it previously. But it turns out to be relatively reliable now, or at least not as unreliable. Sometimes that's the best you can hope for when it comes to training. Nobody knows anything and everyone is guessing. Although it does depend on what device you're using as a power meter. Some watches, like the one I use, offer a power readout, but there are also devices you attach right to your shoes. This was the first time I ever used a power meter to get me ready for a race, making this a more interesting and a fun experiment for me. I wasn't sure how effective it would be, but I was interested in finding out. I'm gonna go more in depth on training with power in another video because that topic deserves its own discussion apart from my recent race experience. But contextualizing all this is a sort of preamble to what I'm going to describe as we go along, and it will help make sense of why I even bothered to run this last race, irrespective of how I trained for it. And it also contributes to what I'm hoping to achieve going forward as I deal with the inevitable decline that aging athletes have to contend with as the mileage adds up and performance trends down. The race I did is called the Annual Fall Classic 5 and 10 miler road race. This was the 37th edition of it, making it the oldest race in my city besides the Terry Fox Run. That's pretty cool and also helps explain why it still uses miles in a metric country. The race harkens back to a time when we just arbitrarily made up measurements and distances and ignored things like standardization and base 10 measuring systems. But I don't mind this race being measured in miles or that the distances confuse people only familiar with the metric system. Like, none of the runners I know are out there doing 8-kilometer or 16-kilometer races on a regular basis because, for the most part, there are none, except for this one. And it's probably one of my favorite races in the city I live because of that quirk. I have done this race 3 times now, as of this last attempt. And each time I've done it in a suit. Why? I have no idea, but it bears mentioning because it affects how a person runs, or at least how I run.
Oh man, this suit is heavy.
And seriously, I'm not a running costume person or even given to trying to attract attention to myself at these races. It's the only race I have ever worn a costume for, and I've done that the 3 times I have participated in the 10 miler. Technically, I have done this event 4 times. I competed at the 33rd edition of this race, though not the 10 miler. I only did the 5-mile event the first time I did it. That was in 2016, and I didn't wear a suit for that race. I went with a standard issue pair of running shorts and a shirt to match.
But these are my recreation clothes.
But I came back in 2018 and 2019 and opted to do the 10-mile distance for both of those. And for whatever reason, I woke up the morning of the race in 2018 and decided to wear a novelty suit with stars printed all over it that I bought for a Christmas party in 2017. It just seemed like a good idea at the time, even though I couldn't really articulate why then or even now. The race was put on hiatus in 2020 and 2021, so I didn't run it either year for obvious reasons. Somebody ate a bat, and the whole world had to close down for a while, and that included running events. But I was excited when I found out it was a go for 2022, so I signed up and pulled the suit out of storage. As luck would have it, the suit still fits, so that guaranteed a return appearance. 3 separate races in the same suit each time. That makes for fun, if pointless, reference points in my running history. Though I can't really compare performances year to year in a linear fashion, or if I do compare them, I'm not sure there are any takeaways for me or even you watching this. Too many variables are at play, making the data less than ideal for comparison. But the outcomes do tell a story, if nothing else. I ran the 5-mile event in 2016 and actually finished 3rd overall. So that was a solid effort that took me to the podium my first time out at the event. I was in much better running shape back then and as a result was rewarded with a 3rd place finish in a fast race. Turns out it took me 5 years to do the event 3 more times, but I didn't race the 5-mile distance again. I raced double the distance in each of the subsequent races I did, opting for the 10 miler instead. Like, 5 miles in a podium finish is great and all, but it was over so quickly. I completed the 5-mile race in 37:09 that day. The drive there and back took longer than that. Doubling the distance felt like I was getting more value per mile. To that end, I haven't been on the podium since that first race. I believe I ran well enough to be in the top 15 overall the next 2 years I did it, running 1:15 in 2018 and 1:17 in 2019. This past attempt at the 2022 edition of the race was a 1:25 finish and not even close to the top 15, let alone a podium spot. I know that looks like a huge drop off in performance from a time and pace perspective, but let me explain what's contributing to those numbers, particularly that last one. A podium finish at 5 miles followed by 3 consecutively slower runs at the 10-mile distance seems damning. The last one in particular is a full 10 minutes slower. But it's not just age-related declines in performance year to year. Not entirely, at least. Wearing a suit certainly didn't help during the 10-mile events, to be sure. It's hot, doesn't breathe, chafes a lot, and isn't even made for running. But this last race, I also added a baby stroller and a 2-year-old passenger to the mix. My son Wyatt came with me this time out, riding shotgun for the entire event. Although he fell asleep before we crossed the finish line. I guess I needed to run faster, but that was the best I could do. 1:25 with a toddler and a stroller isn't all that bad in my biased opinion. You have to look out for number 1. As I said, still in a suit. I feel like that needs to be pointed out often so I get a little bit more credit for it. Up to this point, nobody's really cared, and that hurts my feelings a bit.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
It's tough to say if I could have done any better than my 2018 and 2019 performances if I had left my son at home to race solo. But even if I beat my previous times, it wouldn't have meant as much. This was our first legitimate race together, and I loved sharing the experience with him. Although in a technical sense, this was his second race with me. I did a 10-kilometer race earlier last year with friends and students from my boxing classes. I took Wyatt with me to that because it wasn't about the race itself or the pace that I was going to run it. The main reason for doing that race was to get my friends and former students out of the house doing something fun together again. With the boxing gym closing down and my classes getting canceled as a result, I saw running as a good means of staying in touch and finding a way to connect with everyone again. In that respect, it mostly worked. We all got together and mostly stayed close together for the race. But I certainly wasn't racing in the traditional sense of the word. It was meant to be a fun run with friends, and that's exactly what it was. We got together, we ran along at a leisurely pace, and closed out the day with laughs and high fives at the finish line. Okay, there were no high fives. Most of the people assembled that day didn't want to run at all, and they only came because of how much pressure I guilted them into feeling. But none of us were there because we were racing. It really wasn't about that. However, the 10-miler with Wyatt was all about racing. Partly because I love this particular race and its history as old as it is, and I want to do honor to that history. And partly because I wanted to see how Wyatt and I would do in a race where pace mattered. As in, could I avoid being in last place, pushing my son in a running stroller at a race that has historically been quite fast? And I managed exactly that, coming in almost exactly middle of the overall pack. I'm going to count that as a decent enough result in that I didn't know if I'd be able to find a sweet spot between speed and stamina with a race pace effort while pushing a pram. So my race time looks bad compared to previous years. I concede that. But it looks great from the perspective that I got to race with my son beside me and watch him eat my post-race pancake breakfast like he just did all the running that morning and I sat in the stroller. Which I'll be honest, might have been a lot easier for me and more fun for him. Regardless, it was a good time that made for a cool running experience with Wyatt. Though my running performance might have been slower as a result, my parental performance more than made up for it as far as I'm concerned. I hope as far as Wyatt is concerned too. Thanks for doing the race with me, buddy. Your dad loves you so much. And thank you for making this race more meaningful to me than you will likely ever know.
Regrets, don't you?